There are two main ways for speciation to occur: allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. And allopatric speciation implies that there has been some sort of geographical barrier that has popped up between two populations and caused them or given them the opportunity to diverge into separate species. And in sympatric speciation, you're able to do that without the barrier. So let's say that you have a single species of fish in a pond like this, right? Where you have this big, tall barrier, but it's not really a barrier because the water level is high and fish can swim across it and mate with one another. But if the water level goes down, then all of a sudden this could be a barrier, right? And then the fish on this side and the fish on this side, which are now in two separate ponds and are geographically isolated from one another, may respond to different selection pressures, right? Because maybe there's a predator on one side and not on the other, or they may just, through genetic drift, by chance, happen to go in different directions, but they can become separate species because of that geographical isolation. In sympatric speciation, without that barrier developing, you have to find another way to become reproductively isolated without that geographical isolation. Now, as you might imagine, allopatric speciation is easier to occur and it's more common. And it's a lot of what Darwin saw when he was at the Galapagos Islands. One example is the flightless cormorant of the Galapagos. It seems to have originated from a flying species of cormorant on the mainland that some founding population found its way to the island. Didn't really need to fly anymore because there were no predators. And it's expensive. Flight is an expensive feature to maintain, and over many generations it became flightless, and that geographical separation of that ocean is what maintained that reproductive barrier. So this is allopatric speciation. Now, something that might create a geographical barrier for one species may not create a geographical barrier for another species. So if you look at the Grand Canyon, for instance, right? It creates a geographical barrier for these two. But while it may be difficult for a rodent to cross from the north rim to the south rim, it's not difficult for a bird, right? Or for a large mammal, maybe like a coyote that has a larger range or something like that. And so for these rodents, this is a geographical barrier that has caused allopatric speciation. Again, for the condor, which you can see occasionally flying over the Grand Canyon, this would not be a geographic barrier to cause allopatric speciation. Now, just because a geographical barrier pops up does not mean they are all of a sudden separate species, but it gives them a chance to become separate species because they're reproductively isolated. And then whether it's mutations that pop up in one population or another, or genetic drift, again, it can be just a random genetic change over time, or very often natural selection, these isolated species can become separate from one another. And one example of this is mosquito fish in the Bahamas. So these mosquito fish wound up in lots of different small ponds. And some of those ponds contained predators, others did not. And the ones that were under high predation wound up becoming shaped different. They're more aerodynamic because they're under higher predation and have to be faster and more difficult to grab. Under low predation, they maintained a different shape. And if you diverge enough, if at some point later on in time species are reintroduced to one another, they're so different that they can no longer exchange DNA, they can no longer mate with one another successfully, and so you wind up being different species. One example of allopatric speciation is a set of sibling species of snapping shrimp, which were separated by the Isthmus of Panama. So the Isthmus of Panama is an isthmus as a connector, right? And this connects essentially South America to North America. It's where we built the Panama Canal because it was a very narrow space to connect the two oceans. But it didn't used to be there, right? Ocean levels were over top of it. And when it formed, it separated several of these species of snapping shrimp, and they wound up diverging into separate species. Generally, regions with lots of geographic barriers are also going to have more species. So if you think about archipelagos, like the Galapagos Islands or the Hawaiian Islands, which have a string of islands that are pretty close together out in the middle of the ocean, each of those islands is isolated from the other islands to some degree, and so you end up having lots of different species on these archipelagos. Additionally, reproductive isolation tends to increase as distance between groups increases. So dusky salamanders that live further apart tend to be more reproductively isolated than those that live close together. And here's a look at our data about our dusky salamanders. So as you get more and more kilometers away, your measure of reproductive isolation gets higher. And reproductive isolation can be measured, well, you can measure genetic isolation. You can just look at genetic differences. But reproductive isolation is looking at when you take individuals from a certain distance apart, how likely are they to mate and how successful are they at having offspring. One interesting way to measure this in a lab is to do it with fruit flies because they're excellent organism for research. They're easy to keep, they're cheap, they have relatively short reproductive lifespans and generations. And so we've got an ancestral group of fruit flies. So all of these fruit flies initially came from the same place. And they were separated into two separate populations. Well, really four, but two of them were raised on starch medium. Two of them were raised on maltose medium, and they were allowed to go on for 40 generations, which is not that long for flies, but 40 generations is how we would measure that in terms of evolution. And then at the end, if you looked at males and females that were both raised on starch medium, they had a lot of mating success between the two, but if you had a male or a female from starch mate with another individual that was raised on maltose, you had significantly less reproductive success. Now, you didn't see this with the control, where you were raised in different bottles but on the same medium, right? There was, some difference, right? Opposite populations mated together a little bit less, but not significantly less, which shows that natural selection to better exploit starch or maltose was most likely the cause here. Sympatric speciation occurs in populations that overlap geographically. So obviously this is a little bit more difficult, but it does occur in the wild. One example of how this can happen actually very quickly is polyploidy. So last semester you talked about ploidy, like haploid and diploid, meaning one set of chromosomes or two set of chromosomes. Ploidy just has to do with the set of chromosomes, and polyploidy means an extra set of chromosomes due to a mess up during cell division, specifically meiosis. And again, this is it's not common, but over the history of life, it's happened a fair amount of times, generally more often in plants than animals. And it can happen in two different ways. An autopolyploid is an individual that has more than two chromosome sets, all derived from the same species. And an allopolyploid is where you get two different species that have come together and formed multiple allele sets. Well, how does this happen? Well, here's what it could look like in terms of allopolyploid. So two separate species, right? So we have species B and species A. Species B has an error during meiosis and non-disjunction occurs. So we keep both of our sets of chromosomes. Species A has gone through normal meiosis. Species A manages to fertilize species B somehow. And now you have a unique nucleus, right? That's not like species A or species B. And you would think, well, this is not going to be able to mate with anything, right? It's sort of partially diploid, partially haploid. What in the world can you do? Well, if this individual then mates with species A again and brings in sort of these three single chromosomes, which match up with these single chromosomes, well, bam, then all of a sudden you get a diploid species that is different from species A and different from species B. Now, this could be an issue when it goes to mate with somebody else, but particularly in plants, you can self-fertilize. So this new species, even if it can't find anybody else with the same number of chromosomes to mate with, it can mate with itself, and it can produce its own population. And this may seem crazy, but this has actually happened a number of times in some very economically important plants. A lot of crops, things like oats and cotton and potatoes and tobacco and wheat and corn, are polyploids at least once in their history. And again, this in a single generation creates a new species, even in a sympatric situation where you don't have a geographical barrier. Now, without polyploidy, you can still get sympatric speciation, but you have to have some sort of strong disruptive selection, meaning as opposed to stabilizing selection, where you're pushing everybody in a population to some sort of median, or directional selection where everybody's getting pushed in the same direction, like larger wings or smaller eyes or whatever it is. There is selection away from a median and towards two different extremes. One example of this could be habitat differentiation. So in North America, the maggot fly of North America lives on the native hawthorn trees. But in North America, we've also got a lot of apple trees, which are not native to the continent. We introduced them a long time ago, but they are everywhere. And so the North American maggot flies, some of them have started to live on apple trees. And apple trees mature earlier, which selects for these maggot flies to become sexually mature earlier, to develop sooner. Whereas the ones that are still relying on the native hawthorn trees will be selected for to develop later. If you develop somewhere in the middle, well, you're not going to do so well with either tree. And so this is temporal isolation, right, developing, and it's a type of disruptive selection here. Sexual selection can also drive sympatric speciation when you tend to get females that are attracted to a certain coloration or a certain trait. If more than one of those traits pop up, then you can get disruptive selection. So here's an example in Lake Victoria with cichlid fish. So these are two very closely related species. We consider them separate species of cichlids in Lake Victoria, and they tend not to breed with one another, but some scientists were wondering why. They had hypothesized that the reason was simply sexual preference for this color versus that color, right? And so what they did was they took these fish and they tried to mate them in normal light, and then they took them and put them in this monochromatic orange light, which minimizes those differences, to see whether they would mate in either treatment. And under normal light, they did not mate. But under monochromatic light, they would occasionally mate with one another, indicating that the thing that was maintaining this reproductive isolation and causing this speciation was this coloration. So to quickly review, in allopatric speciation, some sort of geographic barrier comes up and isolates those two populations reproductively, and then via either natural selection in different directions on each side of that barrier, because maybe there's a predator on one side and not on the other, or different predators that require different traits to get away or hide, that can diverge those populations. You can also have divergence due to just time and chance, genetic drift, or sexual selection in isolated populations. And even if those populations become restored to where they could theoretically interbreed, they have diverged so much that they can't anymore. Sympatric speciation operates without a geographic barrier, so you have to have some sort of strong reproductive barrier that's not geographic, some sort of disruptive selection that's very strong, or something like polyploidy. And very often that disruptive selection can be sexual selection.